So hi everyone, I'm Calvin French-Owen. I'm CTO and co-founder of Segment. This here is Tido Carriero, our VP of engineering. And today we'll be sharing a few of the things that we've learned kind of as we've grown over time when it comes to hiring and running a recruiting process. So before we get started, I figured it'd be good to kind of set some context about where Segment is at as a business, because a 10-person startup looks very different than a 100-person startup, looks very different than a 500-person startup. And kind of at the core, Segment is a customer data hub. You can think of us as collecting things like page views, user events, whatever kind of you're tracking as a business from a metrics perspective, and then putting those in the tools that you want to use, whether that's Salesforce, Zendesk, Google Analytics, maybe a data warehouse like Redshift, kind of any of these different tools that you're using for your business to understand the health of your business and what your users are doing. At this point, we process about 90 billion events every month. I think our peak RPS hits about 80,000 requests per second. We have currently 170 employees, the majority of which are headquartered in San Francisco, but we also have a sales and customer support office over in New York and an engineering office in Vancouver. And currently we support thousands of startups and online businesses sending data to us every day. Probably a handful of you in here who are using Segments, up to companies like Crate & Barrel, Nike, Bonobos, etc. But that story has changed a lot over time. And actually, for years, we were basically just 4 people in a room, kind of getting to the point where we're at today. And for this talk in particular, I'm going to share a few stories and techniques that we used in the very early days to start hiring people and start identifying engineers. And then I'll transition things over to Tido, who will talk about how he really started scaling the machine. So for those of you who are at really early stage startups, and actually, could I get a show of hands? How many people are in kind of a 1 to 10 person startup? OK, and then maybe 10 to 50? Anyone 100 plus? OK, so it seems like most people are in the 1 to 10 phase. When we were in the 1 to 10 phase, or looking at us today, we're currently at this 170 people. We had a lot of questions about how to get here when you start here, where your entire dev team shares the same tube of toothpaste. You have whiteboards which line the walls. Maybe you eat pasta every day for lunch like we did. It's kind of a long jump to start actually building something that people want and hiring people. And I should caveat this and say that until you find product market fit, there's really no point in hiring anyone. So kind of our first steps in hiring people came post-product market fit. If you're curious about learning more about that, my co-founder Peter actually has an amazing talk that was given as part of this year's startup school, where he discusses our whole journey to find product market fit and identify it in the first place. But once we'd kind of launched Segment as it exists today, we'd started getting initial product market fit. People were using the tool. It was kind of the first time that we'd ever felt any sort of success after failing for about a year and a half. We started looking for talent, or people who could help us move faster by building out more pieces of the product. And instead of looking in places like LinkedIn, where we search for Google and Amazon engineers, or Facebook engineers, or doing things like using an external recruiter, or looking at these kind of lists of talent, we took a different approach. We started looking for unusual areas to find talent. And one of the first people we found was Amir. Now, Amir is an interesting person. We hired Amir in December 2013. He was one of the first engineers to join the team. Amir has a very unusual profile. He wasn't in the Pacific time zone. He lived in Israel at the time in this town called Beersheba. He was living at home with his parents. He had no secondary education to speak of, didn't come from an MIT or a Carnegie Mellon or a Stanford. He wasn't from Google, Facebook, or Amazon. And actually, at the time, he'd worked for a dev consultancy for about 3 months. That was his only prior work experience. And in total, he had 2 years of programming experience. Very different from most of your typical canonical Silicon Valley candidates. Yet Amir is insanely productive. He's honestly one of the top engineers at our company today, and basically every day he's grown and learned more and just has a voracious appetite for self-improvement. When we ask one of the people who collaborated with Amir on open source, what he said he admired most about Amir is his focus. He says, "We worked together during the summer of 2014. During this time, Israel and Gaza were launching hundreds of rockets at each other. Multiple times each day, Amir would have to step away to go to the basement for shelter. And then a few minutes later, he would return and get back to work." Now, Amir is an insane case. You might be thinking, like, how on earth did you ever find this guy who doesn't have much of a web presence, has no LinkedIn profile, no resume? Like, how on earth did you meet? And for that, I'd like to talk briefly about this little community that we were part of back in 2013 called Component. Now, Component was this tool that's similar to what Yarn or NPM give you today. It was this package manager for JavaScript for the front end, but before kind of any of those things existed. It was written by this guy, TJ, who also later worked at Segment, and there were about 15 to 20 people in this really tight, kind of small community. And everyone was actually focused on building out this tool to kind of make this front-end JavaScript world a much better place. So Amir would create pull requests to improve parts of the product. Ian, one of my co-founders here, would reply, edit things. TJ would be up in there, commenting on pull requests, adding his feedback and his critiques. And what started happening with everyone kind of working on this product for the next 4 months, well, not even product, it was just a tool at the time, is that we all got to know each other really well. And we all had a lot of data on what each other's contributions work like, what it was like to actually work with someone. Amir was familiar with our work, and we were quite familiar with his. And kind of by the end of it, we had this really good picture of how Amir worked and how the rest of the community kind of understood his work and appreciated it. And it's something that we never would have gotten from LinkedIn. It's something that we never would have gotten from a resume. But because we had this really small community of tight-knit developers, and we started being kind of this bigger fish in this really small pond, we were able to actually hire maybe 3 or 4 different people, all just from that community. So my general advice is to go to where the action is. Find those small communities. A lot of them are on GitHub. New projects like Elixir or Rust are starting to create a lot of buzz and action. But in total, there's maybe a few hundred people who are actively involved with them. Sign up for mailing lists. There's this one kind of famous one for Python called Python-Ideas. And this is where anyone who's proposing new language features for Python signs up and sends out ideas. And you'll keep seeing the same names over and over again of the people who are active in this community. Twitter is a good source, joining the right IRC channels, signing up for particular subreddits and being active there. Kind of wherever you see something new happening, find these small communities of people who like to work on similar things. And that's where your best early hires will come from, at least in our experience. Now, once you actually find people, kind of the second next hurdle that you have to get over is getting your name out there. And oftentimes as a small early stage startup, this can feel really hard. You're competing against Google, Facebook, Netflix, Amazon, all of these name brands that everyone already knows, and they know that they have insane scale, they have good career development programs, they have products that are used by billions of people every day. Now you, on the other hand, you have your room of 1 to 10 people. You got to find some way to let people know that, hey, 1, you exist, and 2, you're doing something cool. And for that, it can be really tricky because for most of these other startups out there, they're trying to do the same exact thing. You're trying to rise above this kind of cacophony or din or echo chamber of all of these different startups who are trying to get the attention of kind of engineers or potential employees in the valley. And to that I say, the answer is write. You can really write about almost anything, provided that it's interesting. Now, what does it mean to make something interesting? I'd like to first share a story. Back in, 5 years ago, February 2013, we just launched our product, and we'd launched the ability to send data into Segment from JavaScript, I think Python, and kind of a couple other libraries. And one of the big libraries that we were missing was the ability to send data into Segment from PHP. People said, hey, we want some sort of thing out of the box that lets us send you data. Now, the problem was that no one really knew PHP out of the four of us. And so I basically drew the short straw here, and I ended up writing the first version of the PHP library. And you might be thinking, like, oh, okay, some sort of PHP connector to get data into Segment. That doesn't sound very interesting. Multiple companies do this probably like 10 times a day. But looking a little deeper, I found there were a lot of things with the PHP library that were actually kind of hard problems to solve. In particular, we wanted to send data to our servers without kind of blocking the user's experience when they were loading this page. To give you a brief summary of kind of how PHP works, like the user sends a request, the PHP script executes, and then sends back a response. That means that if you're talking to Segment somewhere in that request, you end up slowing down the page load for the user. So you'd hurt their user experience in order to get analytics data. Not a good deal for anyone. So we started coming up with 2 or 3 different ways to make what are called asynchronous requests in PHP. We wrote this blog post and said, hey, here's all the ways that we've made our library kind of like able to handle this weird edge case that PHP requires you to do. In particular, you might think, hey, no one actually has to do this, right? Like, had I not worked at Segment, I probably never would have done asynchronous requests in PHP over the course of my career. But there are certain things that are actually a lot more universal that can appeal to a much broader audience, particularly if you go deeper and below the surface. These are things like talking about how the TCP connection works, the extra handshake from TLS or SSL, the syscalls that are being made. Basically, all of these areas of performance which actually now appeal to a much broader subset of engineers and just people who are interested in this kind of stuff. In particular, that does really well when it comes to things like SEO. People read this article, they liked it, they started linking to it, and pretty soon it cropped up as one of the top results, which other people used to actually find out, hey, Segment is a business, and here's some example of what their engineering team does. This is something that we actually still do today. Amir, who I was talking about 5 or 10 minutes ago, recently wrote a post talking about how we deliver billions of messages exactly once. And on the face of it, you might think, oh, okay, this is not that interesting. They basically check whether they've seen a message before. If they have, they throw it out. If they haven't, then they pass it along. But if you go a level deeper than that, if you go below the surface and you say, oh, okay, well, how does that work? How does that work when you have billions of these messages? You'd say, well, there's actually this database called RocksDB. It's like, okay, how does RocksDB work? Well, RocksDB has this concept of mem tables that it's writing to in memory, and then those get persisted to SS tables. Those things are sorted, and then it allows you to search with O log n time. You keep getting to these levels deeper where you say, how does this work? How does this work? You can get to the point where you're at the transistor level, the electron level. Whatever it is, that's where the meat of your interesting content is. And it turns out that a lot of people tend to agree. It's like, you don't have to go over sort of a surface level thing that only serves your business. You want to get down into specifics. You want to get into the meat of it. And I've actually lifted this from the Priceonomics Content Marketing Guide, which is actually very good, but they talk about why most company blogs are so bad. And kind of the root of the matter is that most of them are incredibly self-serving. Their focus is not on teaching the reader or educating, but it's on promotion, right? It's on getting more signups or sales or like showcasing a particular piece of functionality. At Segment, we take the opposite approach. We say the number one goal is to teach your audience and your readers something new. That's what people want to read. And in a case where you have basically infinite content, which is just a few clicks away, learning something new becomes kind of the top way to separate your content or your ideas from the echo chamber that's generally out there. So write. Go below the surface level. Talk about the nitty-gritty details. Show. Don't tell. Don't bring kind of an obvious point up to your audience. Instead, show them all of the supporting evidence, show them how things work, and then let them draw their own conclusions. And finally, just teach something. If you ever have some case where you ask, how does something work, and you don't know, go find out, and then write about it. And then everyone else can learn as well. Of course, this applies not just to blog posts, though those are one of the techniques that we've used most. This works for open source, where you're just active in a community. You're taking internal tools that you have, and you're putting them out there for the world to use. This happens with talks. You can give talks explaining exactly what's going on internally, share them with everyone else. And this happens with things like your company pages that you put up. When people go to your jobs page, or maybe your engineering page, they're not looking for a list of open positions. They're looking to understand what it's like to work at that company. And so we've invested a lot in trying to give people a window into what it's like to work at Segment, just from this page. So throughout all of these things, the common theme is just share. Take stuff that's internal and make it external. It's kind of my philosophy that every business out there has a very fascinating story. It's totally unique, it's different, there are different metrics which matter, different problems, different complications, but all of them need telling. If you're not sharing what you're doing internally, you could have the coolest startup in the world, but no one would know about it, and no one would want to join in. So that's why things like taking in internal bits of documentation, internal tools, and making them external, and sharing what you're doing as part of blog posts and writing is kind of the key to getting above that echo chamber. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tido, our VP of Engineering.
All right, so a little bit of context about me. I joined Segment just over a year and a half ago. We had about 10 engineers at the time, and sort of my mandate was to build a world-class engineering team. We've gone from about 10 engineers to about 50 today, and hoping to basically double for the next 2 years or so, and then we'll figure out double year over year, and we'll figure out where to go from there. So I'm coming from a slightly different angle. I want to take all of this like amazing engineering brand work that Calvin leads and turn it into results and people sitting in seats writing awesome code. So I often talk to founders in the stage of maybe 5 to 10 employees. Often they're thinking about hiring a VP of engineering, want to know what those folks do. Sometimes they have a VP of engineering and they're wondering how to set goals. Sometimes they're thinking about hiring a recruiting team and wondering what does a recruiting team do. So I've tried to package up a bunch of these pro tips into 10 or 15 minutes, some of the more interesting pieces. And then I'd also love, well, we'd both love to take questions at the end if we haven't covered anything. So I'm going to pretend you're a company of about 10 people and you want to like take things to the next level. I'll talk about some of the things we've done to actually scale that machine. Cool. So first I want to talk about hiring a recruiter and what recruiters actually do. I think there's a lot of confusion about sort of where ownership lies with the hiring piece, and I have my own unique perspective on what I think recruiters do really well and also what they don't do. I have some tips on each of the 3 kind of phases of the recruiting funnel: sourcing, interviewing, and closing. Obviously, funnels all look a little different, but I think these are the 3 main phases that I think are interesting to talk about. And then finally, I'll leave you with some thoughts on the stuff that's actually worked, the hard stuff, versus just spraying and praying. So we'll start with hiring a recruiter. I first got to Segment in late 2015, December 2015, and there was no technical recruiter. And I was like kind of in a panic because I was pretty sure we needed a recruiter. I wasn't sure exactly what we were looking for, and we found Natasha. Natasha joined just a few months after I joined Segment, and I would argue that she is one of the most important hires I've made at Segment and in my career. She has been absolutely incredible leading the technical recruiting arm of things. But I think it's important to realize what Natasha does and is amazing at and what she doesn't do. So I'm going to say something very trite. You've all heard this before. Recruiting is everyone's job. I'm saying it because it's very true. Recruiting is not Natasha. I mean, it is Natasha's job, but if I just said, like, Natasha, go recruit a bunch of awesome engineers, Natasha is not equipped to do this completely on her own. She needs the help of the founders. She needs the help of the executive team. She needs my help. She needs the help of all of our senior engineers. She needs the help of our engineering managers. She needs everyone's help because this is a team effort. She is the quarterback who kind of runs the process and figures out the logistics. She can amplify our actions. She can help amplify our brand, but she does not create those things from scratch. We all create those from scratch together, and then Natasha helps amplify it, and Natasha's team now as well. And I think there's a second point, which is it's not just everyone's job, but it's especially the job of all of your engineering leaders. This is your more senior engineers. This is people who are asking, hey, can I get into engineering management? This happens a lot with our team. The answer is always yes, you can get into engineering management. Why don't you start by referring someone, or why don't you start by writing an interview question, or why don't you start by going and doing some of your own sourcing? This is what our eng managers at Segment do. They spend about 60–70% of their time hiring. Not always, but in an ideal world. So why don't you go demonstrate with some of your extra 10 or 20% time that this is something you're passionate about? I think a lot of people get into management for the wrong reasons, and then they quickly realize that the job is basically hiring, and they're like, whoa, I don't like this. I think it's really like a nice little hack that when people start asking about this, you just send them toward some eng recruiting tasks and see how they like it. And some people fall in love with it, and they're going to be your best managers. Some people are like, whoa, this is not what I wanted. I'm going to like go back to the IC track. That's also totally fine. But really setting the culture that if you are going to be an engineering leader at the company, one of the big things you're going to need to do is help recruit and help drive the brand and help actually execute on the recruiting strategy. So I think that's, I just wanted to call out, like, recruiting can help amplify everything. So when you have a good idea, you have an awesome piece of content like the blog post, they can take it and they can help spread it, they can help operationalize it, but they can't actually create it from scratch. And I think a lot of people hope when they hire their first technical recruiter, especially if they hire an amazing recruiter, that this person is going to be able to do a lot of those tasks. They cannot do those tasks. They can help amplify those tasks, but if you don't have a strong strategy, you don't have strong content, you're not going to get anywhere. Cool. So I wanted to talk about sourcing, interviewing, and closing as the three main phases. These are just some kind of pro tips we found, some of the things we've done as we've scaled the machine, so to speak. So Calvin already talked a little bit about sourcing. Basically, you want to get incredibly creative about how you're sourcing. The effort you put into this is sort of the output you get out of this process. So yes, you can search for a keyword. You can figure out how to automate this with a script. You can send a LinkedIn direct message or an email to 1,000 people. If you put in about 3 hours of effort, you're going to get a bunch of probably unqualified people responding to your 1,000 emails that you just blasted, and then you can do something with that, or you can realize that was a waste of time. Or you can get really creative. You can get involved in communities the way Calvin was talking about. You can like scour for interesting open source projects that are related to the thing you're building or your core technology. And you can really get into those communities, provide genuine value to those communities, start making friendships. And those friendships can very easily turn into recruiting and hiring people. And I think as we approach this, we really try to do it in a way that doesn't feel salesy at all. It doesn't feel recruiting-y at all. We just are genuinely trying to provide value to the community, and people take note of this. And it can be a slightly longer-term investment, but they will come find you in short order if you've found like an interesting fit. Another one is calibrating early and often. This gets back to sort of my point about recruiting helps amplify what you're doing. I think of it as like I have a hose and I'm like pointing the hose in the right direction, and recruiting like helps blast water out of that hose. If that hose is pointing in the wrong direction, we will be blasting water at a ton of candidates and finding a bunch of traction in slightly the wrong area, and we're not actually going to find the people we're looking for. So when we open up a new rec, I expect to fail for about 5 to 10 interviews where we're just like not quite finding the right person. I'll give an example. Head of design, a role we just closed that was open for about 5 months. I would say the first month or two, we hadn't even decided exactly what we were looking for, and so we had asked Natasha to go figure out what we're looking for, and so she did a fantastic job for the first month or two, bringing in candidates that sort of matched our vague description fairly well. And it wasn't until the first candidate made it all the way through the onsite, this was about 2 months into the role search, that we actually had to step back and we're like, wait, what are we actually looking for? Because there's like 8 different things a head of design could do. And that moment was the moment we actually started making progress on hiring a head of design, when we had that sort of like definition chat about what it was that we were trying to accomplish. And from there, we started reviewing spreadsheets basically every other day. She would bring a list of candidates. We'd have an in-depth conversation about every single one for about 30 minutes. She would take that feedback, she would run with it, she'd think about it. She'd then bring another list of another like 15 candidates, and we'd have a 30-minute conversation about that. And it was that calibration process, that sort of rejiggering of the hose of exactly where we want to be pointed, that started yielding really, really good candidates. And pretty quickly, we had someone in the pipeline and managed to close them. So I think like often you hope that you can just kind of throw this task on recruiting. That is not at all how it works. It takes a lot of hard effort to calibrate. And yes, they often do a lot of the sourcing actions, but if you're not calibrating very frequently with them, you're going to be wasting your time and their time. Last thing I'll say about sourcing is this is unglamorous work. No one loves sourcing full-time, 40 hours, 60 hours a week. Like, this is not a thing that people love doing. I help with sourcing. All of my eng managers help with sourcing. Calvin is a beast with sourcing. We all do it, so make sure to share it. I think those customized reach outs from the whole, like the broad range of the team really do help, and it's also just not fair to have a single person have this load on their back the entire time. Cool. Interviewing, pretty simple concept here. I think of interviewing as my job is to make sure that the candidate has the best experience ever. As a secondary task, I would also like to gain signal on the candidate and whether or not we want to hire them. But first and foremost, like their interviewing day, or if they're doing some kind of contract work with us or some kind of take-home, their interviewing experience has to be world-class. Actually, a lot of candidates come from referrals of friends who either didn't get an offer or got an offer, had a great experience, but ended up accepting an offer elsewhere. This experience matters like way, way, way more than getting signal. You do want to get signal. You'll find ways of getting signal. But I think the most important thing is make sure they have an amazing experience. To do so, we go crazy custom with how we do loops. Like I was kind of envisioning as I joined Segment, like, oh, okay, we're gonna like really get down this like recruiting machine to like an art a science, and it's just going to be like an absolute machine that we do the exact same loop. We're gonna like crank through these candidates, and we're gonna make offers. We're gonna have awesome stats. Like when I think about what actually happened, like we have gotten more and more artisanal with the way we do interviewing. We'll do like take-homes. We'll sometimes do a couple weeks of contract work if they want to do contract work, and we'll just evaluate the contract work. We'll do whiteboards occasionally. We'll do pair programming on site. We have like 5 to 7 different ways of interviewing people, sort of depending on their preferences. And I think candidates really appreciate sort of this experience and us really like working hard to make sure it's awesome. They definitely take note of it. So on the interviewing side, just make sure that you're giving a phenomenal experience, and don't be afraid to get it down to a science. Just do whatever feels right, whatever you think is going to get signal. I think it's especially easy when you're a smaller company, 5 or 10 people, to really invest in like the perfect interview process for people. It really does help them envision themselves working at your company, and also help them get excited, and they do appreciate that. Closing. So I think we had a huge problem for maybe my first 6 to 12 months at Segment, which is we really didn't have much of an we had an amazing eng brand. We switched focus to a bunch of other things, like getting stuff done for the product, getting stuff done for the infrastructure. and we had sort of gotten off the blogs. We hadn't been doing a lot of conference talks. We hadn't been doing all of the talks that Calvin, or all of the things that Calvin was talking about on the brand side. Beginning of this year, we decided to change that, and a lot of our blog posts, I think we've had, I don't know, five-ish make it to the front page of Hacker News. We've done a lot more talks. We've just been getting our brand back into the community, and it has been night and day closing candidates. When a candidate has already heard of you because they've read 3 blog posts, or they've been watching your product for 2 years and they finally want to talk to you, just the way those conversations go the whole time is incredibly more smooth. The close is incredibly easier. So that Eng brand matters a ton. It matters in ways that are like hard to describe if you're just looking at funnel metrics, because it's not like a blog post always leads to like 20 applications that leads to 2 hires, but that brand makes all the difference in the world when you're closing. How they enjoyed their interview matters so much. I just talked about that. And then we use a bunch of other tools during the close process. We make a close plan. This is something that Natasha quarterbacks. She makes these like pretty epic plans that are often like, you know, timeline down to the day for the next 2 weeks, like leading up to the moment that they're going to make a decision. It's pretty cool. You have to help them set a date that they want to decide by. If you're not, you have to be careful about this. This can sound like an exploding offer. The way we generally frame it to people is, we don't want you to drive yourself crazy. We want you to have some internal discipline about when you're going to decide by. We've seen these things stretch out for 3 months or 6 months or whatever, and it's not good for us and it's not good for you. So let's work on a timeline. We can totally do your timeline, but we're going to ask that you stick to it. And also, if you come back 2 months later and you want a job, we're happy to reconsider at that point. We'll probably still be hiring engineers, but just getting to that date so that there's some discipline about the timeline has been really important. We share all metrics, like seriously all of them. We share all metrics with all employees. We're an early stage private company, so we have the luxury of being able to do that. Basically, I figure by the time they have an offer, I don't want them to not understand some metric and then start day one, and then we're sharing all the metrics, and they're like, whoa, 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 this isn't what I bargained for. So we're incredibly transparent. This is something that candidates really, really, really appreciate, and they take note of. We have them meet the leadership team. Occasionally we'll have them meet the board or a member of the board. This is a huge favor that the board does to us. It makes all the difference in the world. If the candidate feels the love, they feel like they're meeting everyone, they're having the chance to chat with the whole leadership team. That's super exciting for them. One last thing, this is awfully tactical, but we have this equity pitch deck. And the goal of this deck is we really want to walk them through exactly what the equity is worth today, how we think about the equity. We sort of show them the valuation over time, assuming a revenue multiple. We also motivate how we got this revenue multiple. So it's really like a crash course in equity, which I've noticed like most engineers don't actually have a firm grasp of how equity works. And so they also really appreciate just like someone taking an hour to like really explain what this rather mysterious part of the offer is. And obviously equity for earlier stage companies is a huge part of the offer. So we've taken a lot of time to really explain this, and I think the feedback has been unanimously positive on this. So if there's one to do, I would go write an equity pitch deck and make sure that as you're trying to bring people aboard, you're really walking them through how you think about the equity. Cool. So in closing, I want to give the advice of focusing on the hard stuff. It's really easy to like look at a funnel and just like decide you want to blast the funnel and really like go nuts on that. That almost never, like these simple actions of like sourcing 1,000 people or posting a junk blog post up, like they never actually drive results. But every time we've like focused on something genuinely interesting, a genuinely hard problem, those are the times when we've seen outsized results. I'm going to pick on Peter, our CEO. He wrote an okay blog post. It took him about 5 to 10 hours. He basically re-released an open source library that we had written several years before. It's a good library. We don't use it a ton. It just like the post wasn't that compelling. I think it got to 84 points on Hacker News. It got in the low thousands of views. A stellar post. How long did $1 Million Engineering Problem take? I estimated 40 hours. Okay. 40 hours. I've seen them take longer. Calvin is the guru for these. But a post like this can generate 50,000, 100,000 views. It can start getting forwarded internally at companies. This post stayed at the top of Hacker News for about 24 hours. So this post was huge. It takes like a little bit of luck, a little bit of like creative spark, a lot of time, but focusing on these hard things rather than just like, a bunch of these smaller wins almost always has the result. And so I want to tell a final story. This is how we closed Albert, our head of infrastructure. This is also one of the most important hires we've made. I don't wish upon you that any close will ever be as long and arduous as this one was. But I do think it ties together a lot of the themes I've been talking about and kind of show you end to end how this works in practice. So it all started on an offsite. This is taken by Calvin. Amir, who he talked about, was in this picture. We actually we had the team visit the Netherlands so that they could meet Amir, since Amir couldn't take a trip to the US at the time. And so the entire team focused for a week on what we called the AWS stack. This is our Terraform modules library that helps companies get started with Terraform. We decided we really wanted to finish this up. We had a bunch of cool ideas. We wanted to take the time to package it up as a polished open source repo. So we spent a whole week of our entire infrastructure team's time at the time writing this library. Then we wrote a blog post about this library. This blog post did pretty well. Then we waited for stars. We have about 1,300 stars on the AWS stack repo. Then we looked at that list of stars and we started reaching out to people that had starred the library and just trying to gauge for coffee, gauge for interest in Segment, say like you could work on problems like this if you came and joined us at Segment. We sent, this is Natasha, sent an email to Albert. She asked me not to read this out loud, so I will not read this out loud and skip over this. She's embarrassed by it. It's very customized. It's kind of fun. Albert ignored this email, though. So then we made an offer to another candidate who ended up going to Netflix when they did this to him. But this other candidate actually told Albert, like, hey, I just talked to Segment. I had a phenomenal experience. Like, I'm not quite in the right risk-reward ratio that I want to take the Segment offer, but you should really check them out. Albert remembered that he had been kind of intrigued by this email from Natasha, but not actually responded. So Albert finally responds to this email, and we get him into process. Actually, the process here was the quickest part. He absolutely blew us away. We interviewed him. We were decided to make him an offer. That whole thing was maybe 48 hours. This is where the hard part actually began. So he had to meet the entire leadership team. So our exec team on the left, all of our founders here. We had to meet with Voss, one of our board members. Voss did an incredible pitch. I walked him through the equity deck, what I was just talking about before, so he could really understand the equity piece of things. Obviously, coming from a bigger company, he was taking a bit of a cash hit, so I wanted to make sure he really understood the Segment equity. Then he asked for kind of a strange thing. He asked me if 2 of his friends could come to the office for lunch, and I said, I guess so. What's the purpose of this? And he said, well, I really like analogies. Imagine I'm thinking about buying a house. And before I make this big purchase, I'd like some of my friends to come check out the floors, check out the walls, check out the windows. One of these other friends also works at Segment, which was pretty awesome. So we did that. Then he asked for another strange request. He asked if he could do reference checks on me. So he called 3 of my former reports when I was at Dropbox. I may have done a little bit of work to make sure those went well. I thank my friend Mel for really helping us out here. Then we entered maybe the darkest 48 hours of my Segment career. On Friday night, I asked him how things went. He had come in for one final all-hands meeting to just get a sense for how our all-hands work. And he doesn't respond for about 48 hours until Sunday. Turned out he was just hiking through the pinnacles. He was very relaxed. He just didn't have cell phone service. He was excited. A little bit more whining and dining happened, and then finally Albert signed, and he has been one of the most important hires we've made in the last year. He's actually recruited maybe 6 or so engineers since he joined 4 months ago, just to give you a sense of how awesome he is. My point here, big wins are hard. It's like everything I just talked about sort of played a very small role in this process. It's not that every single person you hire is going to be exactly like this. That's not the point. But the point, I think, is when you're scaling the machine, it actually feels very custom, and it feels like you're doing an incredibly custom process for every single person you're talking to. So anyway, wrapping up, from Calvin's points, go to where the action is, share your story. As you start scaling the machine, do so, but think of it creatively and really focus on the hard things. The easy things are going to get you basically nowhere, and the hard things are the things that actually start bringing in results, and it takes time. So with that, I'll turn it over to questions. Thank you very much.